Hi guys, and welcome to another episode. In today's episode, I'm going to be reviewing another video by Judy Cho from Nutrition with Judy. I'm not picking on Judy. I think her first video that I reviewed was very good. The video about poor Saladino. I think she was right about a lot of things. Just slightly disagree with some of the takes that she was suggesting. I'm reviewing another one of her videos because, well, I actually wanted to see this video. She's talking about why blood sugar and fasting glucose goes up and HbA1c go up on a carnivore diet and what to do about it. Now, this is very, very important to me because I see lots of patients on the carnivore diet with a lot of the time their blood glucose and HbA1c levels going up. So I want to see, does she have some very amazing insights into this and what can we learn from this? Now, I've already watched this video in the interest of transparency. And I've got to say, some of what she says, look, may well be true. But I also disagree with some of what she's saying. And I think the use of studies and things like dolphins and cats, equating those to humans, is a little bit silly. You know, people get very heavily criticized. People like Paul Saladino get criticized for using rodent studies, for example. And then we're using studies in cats and dolphins, which have very different metabolisms, especially cats, to humans. But we'll get all into that in the episode. So let's go ahead and watch this episode.
I think if we were to put our logical hats on and to think that in order to lower my blood sugar, when I don't eat sugar at all in my diet, I'm going to add sugar to lower my blood sugar levels. It's so perplexing.
It's not actually very perplexing at all. And she later goes on to say that it's stupid to, or basically stupid to add glucose to try and reduce glucose, add sugar to reduce sugar. Well, that is exactly the same argument that people on keto say. Keto, carnivore, of course, low carb diet, eat fat to lose fat. Well, that's stupid. Why would you eat fat to lose fat? Well, of course, we know better than that now. We know it's not just a case of you are what you eat. You don't just get fat because you eat fat. We know that. But why does it have to be any different for sugar? Why is this so perplexing to think that eating sugar could potentially help with the sugar levels in your body if eating fat can help with the fat levels in your body? It's not actually that dissimilar. And it just takes a little bit of forethought and thinking about what the problems might be and actually looking at the science behind it all. And Judy doesn't go into the Randall cycle at all in this video, which I'm extremely disappointed about. And I don't know if that's because she doesn't know about the Randall cycle, or she doesn't understand the Randall cycle, or she just chose not to include it. I don't know. But for me, I think a lot of this actually comes back to the Randall cycle. And the idea with the Randall cycle, people talk about blocking, quote unquote, the Randall cycle. Now, you can't block the Randall cycle. But in effect, what it really boils down to, the most simplistic version of the Randall cycle, is in your mitochondria, you can burn either carbohydrates, glucose, or fat, ketones and fatty acids, for your fuel source. You can't burn both at the same time. That's effectively what the Randall cycle boils down to in its most simplistic form. And people talk about, quote unquote, blocking the Randall cycle by consuming carbohydrates. If you're consuming too many carbohydrates, then you can't burn fat as a fuel source. Hence, you can't lose your fat and you'll have problems with fat building up. Now, that may well be true to a certain extent. This is not an absolute process, it's a relative process, and you're never going to completely, fully block the burning of one or the other. But if consuming excess carbohydrates can effectively, quote unquote, block the burning of fat, well, consuming little to no carbohydrates and consuming excess amounts of fat, well, what's the reason that that can't happen to glucose and then effectively blocking the burning of glucose or the metabolism of glucose? And therefore, glucose levels can start to build up. And this is what my theory is as to why some carnivores, because we don't really see it on keto, we see it on carnivore. And it's not carnivore immediately, it's carnivore after a little while. So why don't we see it on keto, but we do see it on carnivore? My theory is that it's a kind of quote unquote reverse blocking of the Randall cycle. And the kind of the ultra low carbohydrates is actually in essence just damaging or breaking the metabolism, probably more so to say stalling or blocking the metabolism of glucose, therefore leading it to be building up. And the fix for that is to actually correct that ratio, correct that balance a little bit, add some carbohydrates back in, very small amounts, to effectively unblock the Randle cycle and get that machinery working again. Now, I don't have any proof for this. This is my theory. This follows the theory of the Randle cycle, though I'm not aware of any research specifically that has looked at this. Unfortunately, Judy hasn't spoken at all about the Randle cycle in this video, which I am very, very disappointed about.
If your blood sugar is going up on a carnivore or meat-based diet and it's scaring you, or
which it doesn't really on a meat-based diet. At least I've never seen it on a meat-based diet. I follow a meat-based diet. I follow a probably 95% carnivore diet. I do a low oxalate, low carbohydrate, basically keto, very, very meat-heavy diet. I don't have a raised blood sugar. My HbA1c is amazing. My blood sugar is very low. It didn't go up when I'm doing this diet with carbohydrates, some small amount of carbs, but it did creep up, was creeping up a little bit on the carnivore diet. And I've seen this numerous times with patients with their HbA1c and their fasting glucose actually going up over time on the carnivore diet. They add a tiny bit of carbs back in and it comes back down.
you anxiety or uncertainty, and you're not sure what to do or why it's happening, I highly recommend watching this video.
That is true. A lot of people do get very anxious about this though, because they don't want to have a high blood sugar. So they do get rightly concerned.
Hey guys, my name is Judy Cho and I'm board certified in holistic nutrition. And I have a private practice where we focus on root cause healing. And that often starts with the Carnivore Cures all meat elimination diet.
And the carnivore is an amazing elimination diet. Absolutely. This is, I think, the basis of what I do a lot of with patients as well, but usually transitioning them off the carnivore diet after maybe 30 to 60 days, perhaps 90 days. Or if they otherwise want to carry it on, fine, carry it on and just keep monitoring them.
I've been meaning to do this episode for a while now, but having a full-time practice keeps me busy. But I just wanted to
Oh, I know that as well. I really struggle to get these videos out, and I'm just launching this new channel. I'm trying to do another channel. I'm trying to do a tech channel, all my tech stuff in the background here. I've got so many things going on. I feel you, Judy. I really do.
because one of the big concerns we get on this diet is, why is my blood sugar going up? My fasting glucose, my A1C is up when I'm doing my blood work, and this is causing me to be sick.
That's the question. Is it causing people to be sick, or is it actually a healthy response? And that's the question that Judy's trying to answer in today's video. I don't think she really answers it very well, but that's the question that she's trying to answer. Is it actually a problem? Do we need to worry about it, or is it actually perfectly fine?
Working with thousands of carnivore clients and patients that we actually run blood work on, we have seen that the fasting blood glucose will sometimes normalize in time.
I feel like that's a little bit of a dig at some of the influencers who don't see patients and actually run blood work on people, which, to be fair, I think is a genuine complaint, actually. Some people out there who are claiming to be experts in this field are not seeing patients. They're not seeing patients day to day. They're not doing blood work for people. They're really just, yeah, I'm not even sure what they're doing really, but they're not seeing patients face to face. They're not dealing with these kinds of issues. So all respect to Judy for actually dealing with these things with her patients.
So maybe your blood sugar will be higher for a little bit because the body has to rewire itself to be able to function with less glucose. And so it might just stay in the blood for a little bit. And that can be one of the reasons why your blood sugar is high over time on a carnivore diet or a meat-based.
Possible, though I think perhaps unlikely. There might be some metabolic changeover early on, but I think that's not going to be a cause of any ongoing raised blood glucose. Very, very unlikely.
But that's a very small subset of the reason. It is true that most people's blood sugar goes up if you're eating sufficient meat on a carnivore diet. And I have some thoughts about that, and I'll share that at the end. But for now, let me explain how you can make sure if your blood sugar going up is an issue or not. The first thing I recommend is don't look at any blood work in isolation. Your blood glucose and your A1C measures essentially the same thing. It's measuring.
I would 100% agree with that. We should never look at any one marker in isolation. I am always telling my patients this. They come in saying, well, this thing was raised, that thing was raised. What do I do about this? And I'm saying, okay, but what is the picture? What is the picture that we are seeing? All of these things, A1C, fasting insulin, fasting glucose, C-peptide, NMR panels, lipid panels, triglycerides, HDL, all of these things that we're talking about in this video and lots of other videos out there, they're all pieces of the puzzle. And think of it like a jigsaw puzzle, like 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle or 20, 30-piece jigsaw puzzle. You can't just pick one piece out and plonk it in the middle and say, oh, I know what it is. No, you got no idea what it is. It's just like a splodge. You got no idea what that is meant to be unless you are cheating and you're looking at the box. You got no idea what that's meant to be. You need more pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. And the more pieces you can get, the more you can put, the better idea you're going to get. Now, you might have some missing pieces. Jigsaws in our house, we always have missing pieces. Anyone's house, you probably do. But you might have some missing pieces. But you know what? If you've got 19 out of 20 pieces, you don't necessarily need that 20th piece to see what it's meant to be, to see what it's going to be. But if you've only got 3 or 4 of those pieces out of 20, you probably can't really tell. You can probably guess, but you're probably going to miss the detail and the nuance. And that's what we're talking about here. You can't just pick one figure like HbA1c, fasting glucose, or fasting insulin and say, I'm really healthy or I'm really not. You need to build that picture.
Blood glucose measures sugar in the blood at the given time you've taken blood work. So if you...
It measures glucose in the blood, not fructose. Measures glucose.
Later in the night before you did your blood work, your blood sugar is probably going to be higher. Your A1C...
Yeah, if you're not fasting for long enough, then your fasting glucose is going to be high. Typically takes about 12 hours for it to kind of get out of your system. But again, it depends on what you've been eating and your metabolic function and so on as well. So this is why you shouldn't rely on just a singular blood test. You never should rely on just one single blood test to really make a diagnosis. HbA1c is an exception in that most diagnostic criteria across the world for type 2 diabetes will utilize a single HbA1c result. And that's because it is essentially an average of that blood glucose level, again, not fructose. And this is where Paul Saladino is incorrect. He suggests that it also does measure fructose, and really it doesn't to any great degree, maybe a smidge, but it's basically glucose. It is looking at the average. So that is in effect a 90 to 120 day average of your blood sugar. So it's kind of accepted that this is okay to use as a singular result. Still, most doctors that I know in the kind of functional space would still not necessarily just use that as a singular result. We're going to look at the whole picture and then make a determination. But most likely, if your HbA1c is in that diabetic range, yes, you probably are actually diabetic.
A summary of the last 3 months of your blood glucose, but it tends to show the last 2 months. So if you were sort of not eating a carnivore diet or eating more carbs, that can impact your A1C score. If you just started a carnivore diet the last 2 months versus the 3, that can impact your blood glucose levels. But
that is true. It is weighted somewhat to the last maybe 2 months or so, 6 to 8 weeks, whilst it is a 3 to 4 month average, 90 to 120 days typically. It is more weighted towards the kind of the previous 6 to 8 weeks. Interestingly, though, one of the studies that we will look at a little bit later in my video, Judy doesn't mention it in hers because it doesn't fit the narrative. What they're talking about is HbA1c becomes quite unreliable if the red cell blood lifespan, so the red blood cell lifespan, RBC, is less than 74 days, because it takes about 70 days to get glycosylated, which doesn't actually entirely fit with that 6 to 8 week time frame that Judy's talking about here, which is an interesting point. But there is evidence to support what Judy is saying there. I agree with what she is saying.
The A1C also, it is a measure of hemoglobin's lifespan. So if you're healthy and your red blood cells...
No, HbA1c is not a measure of the hemoglobin's lifespan.
Living longer, there is a higher chance that the average per red blood cell is going to have more sugar than if you were on a high carb diet and the red blood cells are dying early. It's
Maybe. This is not proven. And in fact, I will show you two studies that actually disprove this later on. This is a claim that a lot of carnivores have. People like Anthony Chaffee, Judy Cho, Ken Berry, Sean Baker, they talk about this like it's just gospel, that HbA1c is raised because red blood cells live longer, therefore they are more exposed to blood glucose, thereby increasing the glycation level of those red blood cells, which is what HbA1c is measuring. HbA1c is simply measuring the glycosylation or the glycation of those red blood cells, and essentially average over that 90 to 120 days because that's the typical lifespan of a red blood cell. There is no real evidence that red blood cells living longer causes a rise in HbA1c, despite, and I'll show you later with some studies, that red blood cells, even living longer in a higher blood glucose state, don't necessarily get a higher HbA1c, which kind of suggests that what the carnivore people are saying, that this just happens because, well, carnivore, actually isn't a thing. It also doesn't explain why we don't see this in people following a ketogenic diet. And carnivore is a ketogenic diet, but the key difference there is it's basically zero carb. And this is what we're really talking about here in terms of a zero carb diet. Why are they getting a rise in their HbA1c when people who are fat adapted in ketosis following a ketogenic but not zero carb diet, so say like 10, 20, 30 grams of carbs a day maybe, we don't see it in them. I haven't seen it in me, and that's what I follow. I did see it going up, potentially. I didn't really track it for long enough, but I did potentially see it going up on a strict carnivore, but I didn't see it going up on a ketogenic diet. And this doesn't really explain that. This is a hole in the argument that nobody's actually willing to talk about.
false positive if you want to think of it that way. So for some plant-based people, their blood sugar might look really good, but it's because their red cells are dying earlier. What
Again, I'll show you an article that actually suggests that isn't the case, that just because they die earlier doesn't mean the HbA1c actually goes down.
we recommend in our practice is to actually measure many more things than just these markers. We are not really concerned about blood sugar. Yes, it is the excess
Yes, we are. We are concerned with blood sugar. We truly are.
sugar in your body that can cause damage because it becomes really sticky in your body. Think about corn syrup, and it starts sticking to everything in your body, your organs, your systems. And so it can cause a lot of damage. And that's what we call the oxidative stress. But
We are worried about excess blood sugar. That is absolutely true. But we are generally just worried about blood sugar as well. I think what she might be meaning to say is we're not worried about, normal blood sugar levels. No. We're not worried about normal blood sugar spikes. No, we're not particularly worried about that either. That is a normal physiological response. What we worry about is excess sugar levels, and we worry about excess sugar levels for a long time, which is potentially what is happening to people on a carnivore diet. They're not just having a super kind of temporary spike in their blood glucose. These typically are going on for a very, very long time, if not forever. Though Judy does talk a little bit about this later on, we'll let her talk.
we are really concerned about insulin. And it is the way that if we are becoming hyperinsulinemic or insulin resistant, that's the thing that causes inflammation, weight gain, and so on and so forth. The biggest
Yes, but we are also worried about excess blood glucose, not just insulin resistance.
recommendation we always have to our clients that are worried about their A1C and their glucose levels is to track their insulin. Now, insulin itself is
I mean, yes, but also simply relying on insulin is also silly. I mean, I've got diabetic patients who have a fasting insulin of 2 or 3. Now, they're producing insulin, their C peptide is working, They're not insulin dependent, yet their HbA1c is like 12. Does that mean they're healthy? Because their fasting insulin is 2 or 3, but their glucose is sky high? No, of course it doesn't mean they're healthy. They've got awfully controlled type 2 diabetes. So simply saying that it's fine if your blood glucose is high as long as your insulin's low, no, sorry, Judy, that's not correct.
Very unstable marker to test because it goes up and down. It's a hormone. So it makes sense that depending on what day, what emotions, what stress, what sleep, what food you ate, your insulin will look a little different. So there's several
A little, but not a lot.
markers that we like to look at to make sure and see a more holistic picture of insulin. So we check the fasting insulin, which is the most unreliable marker, but that's the one that most people get. But the fasting
I don't know. I don't agree with that. I don't agree that it's an unreliable marker. Like, yes, it can change, but not that dramatically. And I think if you're going to make a diagnosis based off, say, like a fasting insulin of 2 versus a fasting insulin of 3 or 4, you probably don't really know what you're doing, and you need to be looking at some other results and, and so on.
insulin. And then we look at the LPIR score. So it's the lipoprotein insulin resistance score. That comes with your
Which we don't really get as a standard thing in Australia.
NMR panel. It's a cholesterol panel that shows all the
And yeah, the NMR we don't get as well.
particle sizes and different sizes of your cholesterol markers. And if that LPIR score is high, then it's also a sign that you can be more insulin resistant. And then the other marker to check is your C-peptide. So oftentimes C-peptide gets released with your insulin, but C-peptide is a more stable molecule to test.
This is correct, but it's more difficult to interpret sometimes.
So you have 3 markers you could test other than your A1C and your fasting blood glucose. And if those
But I think you should still test your fasting glucose and your A1C.
insulin markers are pretty well within range of what's healthy, then it's probably not a big issue that your glucose is up. So
No, not necessarily. As I've said, I've got patients with terrible diabetes, yet they've got a perfect fasting insulin, perfect C-peptide.
if your blood sugar is going up, then I would look at those 3 markers again, the LPIR score, the C-peptide, as well as your fasting insulin.
See, I would actually look at things like cortisol, DHEAS, testosterone, male and female, sex hormone binding globulin, male and female. I would look at these things as well to, again, put all those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. What she's saying here is correct, that it's not just looking at one figure and saying you're healthy or you're not. It's looking at the whole thing. And the other thing, of course, is asking the person, how do you feel? If they are having symptoms, that is, of course, a concern. If they're not having symptoms, it doesn't mean they're fine, but it's potentially less concerning. And maybe you can just keep an eye on it for them, monitor them, get them back in a few months' time, something like that, and just see what's trending, see what's happening with them. But I would be checking more things than just what she's talking about here.
Marker to look at is your cholesterol panel. If your triglycerides are above 100 milligrams per deciliter, and again, I'm thinking that you've been on carnivore for a while now. If you were in the 200s for triglycerides and now you're at 150, I think that's great. You're trending in the right direction. But
yes, but I have spoken about this before on my main channel, the Meat Medic podcast, and of course the other video I reviewed of Judy. That can be wrong, and it can put people a false sense of security. This poor man's, kind of lipid subfraction test, it is a very poor man's test. It's not a very good test to simply look at the triglyceride and HDL levels and the ratios between them, because it can be getting better, yet people can be getting more unhealthy, which is actually what Judy said in the other video.
you've been carnivore for a while and your triglycerides are still above 100, there is something that you have to do to change your diet. You might be eating too many liquid fats and your
Yeah, I agree. There's probably something else going on there.
can't handle it. Or you might be eating too much fruit if you're having that as part of your carnivore diet. But
Well, fruit is not part of a carnivore diet, Judy. Yeah.
cholesterol markers can show a level of inflammation in your body as well. And just pro tip, if your LDL is super high and your HDL is above 85, I know for some people that will make you fall into the lean mass hyper responders, but we also see LDL get,
which is essentially a made up condition, a human construct with very little evidence to support it at present. And yes, look, this may well be true. And people like Dev Feldman are doing great work. I'm not criticizing him in the slightest. People like him, Nick Norwitz, etc. Amazing people doing amazing work. And they may well be true. And I really hope they are. But until we have any kind of real evidence or proof, I think it is very dangerous to be relying on this concept of lean mass hyperresponder, which isn't really in the literature. There's no real evidence to support it, and there's no real proof that it's an okay thing. The other thing is, who even is a lean mass hyperresponder? And I've seen countless people coming in to me saying, oh, I must be a lean mass hyperresponder because my cholesterol is sky high. Well, they're not lean and they haven't really got any muscle mass. They might have mass, but they haven't got muscle mass. They're not lean, that's for sure. And no, they're not probably a lean mass hyperresponder. They don't fit the profile at all. Yet they've convinced themselves that they are because, well, my cholesterol is sky high, so I must be a lean mass hyperresponder, and it's all perfectly fine. I think this is dangerous territory, quite honestly.
up, meaning that maybe you're going to have excess in your body because of mold illness, but that is just a side note or a pro tip. Now, going back to the blood glucose levels, when I say it's going up, I don't mean like your blood glucose is in the 130 milligrams per deciliter or that your A1C is 6.0. I'm saying that if you're maybe,
which is typically the cutoff for pre-diabetes, HbA1c of 6.0. I'm not sure exactly of the American units, so I'd have to double check that. But the HbA1c of 6.0 is typically the pre-cutoff for pre-diabetes. Though America does use a 5.7 HbA1c for pre-diabetes. Personally, myself, and a lot of my colleagues in the metabolic health world, I actually think it should be more like 5.5%. Maybe perhaps not for carnivores, maybe, but for standard population. Because above that, people do tend to creep up.
At 5.5, 5.8, or if you're in the low hundreds, that's something that we often commonly see as a carnivore. Now, if it's
5.8, I'd be concerned. 5.5, maybe. Okay, I'd watch that. 5.8, I would be concerned because that is technically in American standards pre-diabetes. Now, again, Judy's kind of arguing here that that's okay because, well, carnivore. But without presenting any kind of evidence really to support, there's certainly no human evidence to support that statement. I think this is dangerous territory. And the question we have to ask ourselves here is Judy correct? And the other carnivore doctors who are saying the same things. And I'm not sure who came up with this first, but they're all kind of repeating the same line of, well, red blood cells live longer, therefore HbA1c goes up because carnivore, yay, it's all fine. They're all repeating the same line. I'm not sure who came up with it, but if they're right, look, great, fantastic. I'm happy to be wrong. Absolutely. But what if they are wrong? And that is the question. What if there's a lot of people out there who are relying on this information, which is being presented with little to no evidence to back it up at all, other than people just saying it is? But what if they're wrong? And what if these people actually do have dangerously high levels of blood glucose? And what if this is actually causing them problems underneath the surface, but they're being told it's fine? That's my concern with all this, is people saying things that they have no evidence to support. That's my concern.
Above 100 or a lot more above 100, that's when I start wondering, how are you eating? And we try to track that. Some people, if they're eating mostly protein without a lot of the fatty meats, that can cause your blood sugar to rise too. Another
That's interesting because when I eat meat, when I wore a CGM, my blood sugar's gone down, not up. Interesting.
thing that you could really do is getting a continuous glucose monitor. So those are those little things that you can attach to your arm or your,
which are useful but less accurate.
And you can see your blood sugar and what it does throughout the full 2 weeks of your life, whether you're sleeping, whether you're awake.
Hopefully you have a life that's longer than 2 weeks. 2 weeks maybe of the sensor life, not of your life, hopefully.
Just track that. And if your blood sugar is, even if it's in the low hundreds, but it's always consistent, so there's not these up and down swings, that is a good sign.
No, Judy, that is not a good sign necessarily. Sorry. CGMs measure your average blood glucose. They are not checking glycosylation. They are not checking fructose levels particularly either. They're measuring glucose levels, just like a blood glucose monitor will. They are a good indication, but they are very often misread because people don't understand what they are looking for. The thing that we're really talking about here is the time or the area under the curve. It's how long are your blood glucose levels elevated for, and to what essentially degree are they elevated? So let me just give you an example here because I would draw it on the screen and so on, but I'm not going to do that now. I haven't got any decent software to draw it on. If your blood glucose is, let's say, 5 for 5 hours, let's just call that 25 blood glucose hour units. Let's just make up some numbers here, okay, to illustrate the point. If your blood glucose is 6 for those 5 hours, that's 30 blood glucose hour units. If your blood glucose is typically 4.5 for 5 hours, that's going to be what, 22.5. But let's say it spikes to say 10, but for 5 minutes, and then it comes back down again. Now, if it keeps doing that every 5 minutes, look, you're going to have a problem. But let's say it spikes 3 or 4 times. Okay, let's say half an hour's worth of it being 10. That's another 5 blood glucose hour units, plus the 22.5 if it's 4.5 otherwise throughout, and give or take a little bit there, that's around 27.5 blood glucose hour units, which is actually lower than if it was sitting at 6 the whole time. So it's not how much it's spiking, it's how much it's going up and staying up. Going up and straight down again is a normal physiological response, and it is better than being slightly elevated, but for a lot longer. And this is a key point with CGMs that people do not understand.
Want our blood sugar to go up a little bit after we eat because that's a normal human biological effect, but you don't want it to go up like super high, maybe 50 milligrams per deciliter above where it was right before you ate, because it is indicative of insulin being released. So when you have these constant roller coasters throughout the day, that blood sugar going up and then insulin having to come to save the day, and then if your blood sugar imbalanced or insulin resistant, then cortisol has to come and save the day, and then that will impact all of your adrenals, your hormones, your stress levels.
Okay, I mean, cortisol doesn't reduce blood glucose. Cortisol increases blood glucose. Maybe what she's referring to there is you might get hypo, and then cortisol has to come and help to release blood glucose. I'm not sure. But a rise in insulin is not a problem. That is not an issue. That is a normal physiological response. If your blood sugar goes up, then basically your insulin is going to go up to compensate, to bring that blood sugar down. That is a normal response. We want that response. What shouldn't happen is your insulin level stays very high, or your blood glucose level stays very high, or your blood glucose levels come down too far too quickly. That can then cause hypos. And this is where we get this disordered glucose regulation if we're insulin resistant or we have other problems going on with our metabolism and our metabolic function. We have metabolic dysfunction. So we actually do want an insulin rise. We just don't want a prolonged rise or an abnormal rise.
Your blood sugar is high and you're not sure if it's safe, you can get a continuous glucose monitor and see the trends to see if it's pretty much within the safe range.
Which that doesn't make any sense because the safe range is for standard people, but she's talking about blood glucose being higher on carnivore is perfectly fine. Is it perfectly fine or is it not perfectly fine, Judy? I'm not sure quite what she's really talking about here. And the other thing is, again, it doesn't matter if it's going up or down. It matters at what level it's staying at and what that time under the curve is, what that average blood sugar is. That's the concern. Outside of hypers and hypos and symptomatic problems, it's really the average blood sugar that we're worried about, not any real one individual value.
Factor I always ask is symptomatology. How do you feel eating this way? If you are sleeping better.
True, But most people with prediabetes don't know they've got prediabetes. They don't have symptoms. They feel fine. Most people with insulin resistance feel fine. They don't really have that much symptoms for the most part, or at least ones that they don't recognize, perhaps is a better way of putting it, as being symptoms of insulin resistance or having problems. So relying purely on symptoms to say, well, I'm fine, I think again is probably not the best way.
Feeling better, you have more energy on a carnivore diet, or things are just a little bit better than they were eating a standard American diet or whatever other diet you were eating, then why does that blood marker matter so much?
Yeah, I would agree somewhat with that. If you're feeling great and you're vastly improved, yes, the blood sugar may not be as much of a concern or any one individual blood marker. I think if you're feeling just a little bit better than like a standard Western diet, I would question there's something going on there because really a carnivore diet, you should feel a lot better than a standard Western diet. So if you're only feeling a smidge better, there might be something actually going on with you underneath the surface. But again, relying on symptoms alone to determine your health, I just think it's not the best idea. And that's why we're talking about getting these kinds of tests done.
I love using logic and just practical thoughts in the way that we think about health, because a lot of times that's our inner innate wisdom. And I just think it's so odd that because our blood sugars are going up, so our A1C shows that there's more sugar in our body, or that our blood shows more glucose in the body. So the answer to that,
So is A1C showing more sugar in the body or is it showing longer red blood cell lifespan? Okay, I'm being a bit facetious here. I know what she's talking about, but still, I think, you need to be consistent with what you're saying. If you're putting this kind of message out, you need to be consistent with what you're saying.
to eat more sugar. So we want to lower our sugar by eating more sugar. Like,
And this is what I was talking about earlier with the Randall cycle. This is where she should go into the Randall cycle to talk about these kinds of things, but she just doesn't. So I don't know whether she doesn't know about the Randall cycle, doesn't understand the Randall cycle, or just chose not to speak about the Randall cycle. If she doesn't think it applies here, I don't know. I personally think it does. I think the Randall cycle is really important here. And the kind of quote unquote blocking of the Randall cycle, whilst you can't really actually block the Randall cycle if we're talking about it in that sense, I think it can go both ways. There's no literature or theory or evidence to otherwise suggest anything different, that it can only go one way and quote unquote block the fat. If you're eating excessive fat and not eating any glucose, theoretically, you could start to quote unquote block the glucose metabolism as well, thus leading to a rise in your blood glucose levels, which is my suspicion as to what's happening on the carnivore diet, which is why it affects the carnivores, not those on a ketogenic diet, at least that I have seen.
me, the logic in that. And I just find it strange
I did just tell you the logic in that.
that we want to reduce our blood sugar levels. And so the way we do that is by eating sugar or
Which I've explained numerous times now.
carbs. Now, I
Excuse me, but it's the same in theory as eating fat to lose fat. Why is it okay when it's fat, but it's not okay as a theory when it's glucose? Cherry picking, maybe?
people do see that improvement. So if they add back carbs, maybe it's lower carbs, so it's not super starchy carbs, and they'll see their A1C go down and their blood glucose goes down. But how do you know that's health? Other than
Okay, but how do we know it's not health? She's kind of suggesting that adding a little bit of carbs in will lower your HbA1c and lower your fasting or random blood glucose. But then she's kind of suggesting that that's not healthy, or that it may not necessarily be healthy. But that is the default position. And when you're talking about, research and so on, I mean, it's been a long time since I've done any real research. I did a BSc in an extra research degree in university. But basically, your null hypothesis, that's your kind of default fallback or the thing you're trying to disprove. In this case, the null hypothesis is lower blood sugar is better. You've then got to disprove that, but she's not disproving it. She's just saying, well, how do you know it's okay to have a lower blood sugar? Well, We know it's okay because that's the default. That's the null hypothesis, because there's been hundreds of years worth of research that has suggested this. There's been no research that has suggested, to my knowledge, there's zero research that has suggested that a higher HbA1c is better. So we have to fall back to a lower HbA1c is better until anyone offers any evidence otherwise, which Judy is not doing.
You're chasing a number, but maybe it's going down because now your insulin has to work a little bit more to shuttle away the glucose. But
No, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Your insulin doesn't have to work harder because you're eating a little bit of carbohydrate. Your insulin theoretically would have to work, or maybe it would have. Let's just say it has to work harder. But insulin has the ability to quote unquote work harder. It doesn't make any sense. Like, if you've got more insulin or it's working harder and it's lowering your blood sugar, that's not a bad thing. Insulin resistance, quote unquote, is the bad thing, not necessarily your insulin levels as such or how, quote unquote, hard it's working. So to say or to suggest that your insulin's working harder is, somehow a bad thing because it's lowering your blood sugar doesn't make any sense.
that change is not really making you feel better. My question to you is, why are you doing that? If you're only doing it to rebalance your blood glucose, I don't know if that's the answer or the ideal thing to do.
Okay, I mean, well, she doesn't know, is what she's saying here. But again, I'm being a little bit facetious. I apologize, Judy, if you do watch this video. I'm not trying to be rude to you. I'm not trying to be a Bark-A. But I think this is important because Judy is basically saying here she doesn't know. And yet she's presenting this video on this is exactly what happens and why. But actually, I don't really know what happens or why it happened. But we'll just assume that it's okay because, well, carnivore and it's fine. But that, I think, is a little bit of a problem. I would also disagree with what she's saying there, that, you're kind of just chasing a number. And yes, look, it's a bit silly to just simply chase numbers. But again, we'll go back to this quote unquote null hypothesis that lower HbA1c is better until someone can prove otherwise, that there's not a harm in having an HbA1c that's higher on a carnivore diet. I think we have to fall back to medico-legally as doctors, we have to fall back to that null hypothesis, which is pretty much held true over a very, very long time, maybe not hundreds of years, like I said, but a very long time, that lower HbA1c is inherently better. And so actually chasing that number is kind of important, actually. I would also argue that nobody is going to know the difference within their body of an HbA1c of 5.7 versus, say, 5.5. They're not going to wake up in the morning and you know what? I feel like my blood sugar is 7.3 this morning. Oh, nobody is that good with their body. So chasing a number, yes, is mostly pointless, but for HbA1c, no, I don't think it is. And you're not going to see the difference in those symptoms by making those small difference in your blood sugar. So to suggest that you don't need to worry about that because you're not feeling any better, I think is a bit silly.
I've been meat-based for 7 years, or strict carnivore for 3 of those. And my blood sugar is in the probably high 80s to low 90s on a daily basis.
Interesting. I mean, I haven't watched a ton of Judy's stuff, but I wonder, why is she not strict carnivore then? If carnivore diet is so amazing, why is she not strict carnivore anymore?
Ketones, I always have at least some 0.5 maybe, but my A1C is about 5.3. Sometimes it'll go up to 5.5, but I'm not too worried.
Okay, I mean, 5.3 is absolutely fine. This is not a problem at all. This is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about A1Cs of like 5.8, 5.9, 6, 6.1, 6.2. I've seen some patients flip into diabetic ranges from the carnivore diet, 6.5 plus. That is not in any shape or form physical adaptation, what she's kind of talking about here. There is no way that is not pathological. No way at all.
used CGMs many times, and my blood sugar is so boring to look at. It's not even fun to use a CGM.
Yeah, to be fair, I did it for like a month. It was so boring. It was like watching paint dry when I was strict carnivore. It was literally just exactly the same virtually the whole time.
And I sleep through the night. And I've done all the other markers of the LPIR, it was around 25 or less, which that means it's the lowest insulin sensitivity. My C-peptide was under 2, and my fasting insulin was under 5. So these are all indicators that my insulin is good. My energy
5 is good, but it's not great. Just saying.
feels pretty good on most days. And so I am not worried that my blood sugar is higher than when I was plant-based. When my plant-based days, I think my blood sugar was in the 70s.
Okay, I mean, but plant-based, you're probably going to feel like shit anyway. But also an HbA1c of 5.3, even 5.5 is really not that much of a concern. I know I said earlier 5.5 people do tend to creep up. So I would watch that, but it's not a huge concern. So, but she's again talking about herself being 5.3 and it doesn't bother her. No, but that wouldn't bother anyone. Whatever diet you were doing, that's a perfectly normal, very healthy HbA1c. We should be talking about people with 5.8, 5.9, 6 and higher. These are the people that should be concerned.
If you're worried about your blood sugar levels, your A1C, your fasting glucose on a carnivore diet, I highly recommend looking at all the different markers, and then you can get a CGM and then also track how you feel. Make sure to get somebody that understands how to read the blood work in a low carb space or
very true. Very, very true.
A carnivore space. We also read and interpret blood work as well and offer blood work. So I saved the best for last. I know people still want to understand, but why is my blood sugar going up? And I found a few studies.
Yeah, because she hasn't actually explained any of it so far.
Where I thought it was so fascinating. And I don't know, this is a working theory right now. So that's why I'm sharing it at the end, because I don't know for certain, but I do.
That's the point. She doesn't know. It's a theory with no evidence to really back it up at all. No human evidence. I haven't seen any carnivore influencer presenting any evidence to support this notion, this idea that HbA1c goes up on carnivore and that it is okay. I've seen no evidence to support that at all. I would love to be proven wrong. I have repeatedly called people out, asking for them to show me some evidence. Absolutely zero. Nothing has ever come my way.
This phenomenon is amazing. So I'm going to share a couple studies as to why I think on a carnivore diet or a diet that restricts carbohydrates, why your blood sugar might go up and why it actually might just be a human adaptive response.
Okay, so before we get into the studies, she's talking about a therapeutic carbohydrate restricted diet, or TCR, otherwise known as a low carb diet. I don't know about Judy. I have never seen a patient on a low carb or ketogenic diet having a rise in their HbA1c or their fasting or random blood glucose. I've never seen it, unless they've gone off the diet. I've never seen it. Carnivore patients, I have seen it repeatedly. And the stricter the carnivore, the longer they're on it, the worse it is. Why is there a difference between those subset of populations? Now, I don't know. My theory is the Randall cycle effectively being blocked, as I've said, with a chronic shortage of carbohydrates. But Judy is lumping keto and low carb diets into that category. I've never seen that on keto and low carb. Maybe Judy has. And look, fair enough. I don't know Judy's patient list and so on, but I've never seen it, that's for sure. And the other thing is she's saying this happens in humans, and it does, of course, that's what we're talking about. But she is presenting studies from cats and dolphins, which have fairly different metabolic processes to humans, especially cats. Cats have very different metabolic processes to humans. Let's let her talk.
I want to Tom Cruise do this! Who sent that thing?
This world can't survive if you stay together.
I didn't need him.
Venom: The Last Dance in cinemas October 24.
Spend your extras limit your way, like getting loads of physio. I know. Cute socks.
Okay, so the very first article is called Normal Glucose Metabolism in Carnivores Overlaps with Diabetes Pathology in Non-Carnivores.
Okay, so when she's saying carnivores, what they're referring to is not human carnivore patients. They are referring to cats and being obligate carnivores. That is a very, very different thing to human beings. But let's let her talk.
Give the disclaimer first that dolphins and cats are not humans, and I understand that, but we consider carnivores mostly dolphins and cats, and they consume a diet.
Yeah, okay, but they're very different to humans. Very different to humans, especially cats.
Protein and fat with little carbohydrate content.
Yes, because they are obligate carnivores. Cats basically, if you read the article that she's linked, they basically lack genes essentially for sweetness, for taste. So they don't like sweet things. Hence, they don't eat carbohydrates. They are obligate carnivores, which is why it's basically animal abuse to put a cat on a vegan diet, just FYI. They need meat, they need fat, they don't eat carbohydrates. Why are we talking about cats when they are entirely different metabolically to humans? The other thing, the article that she references, and I'm going to bring it up here, is this one on screen now. Hopefully it's on screen. And basically, I just want to highlight this section here. So important metabolic pathways known to differ between carnivores and non-carnivores are implicated in the development of diabetes and insulin resistance in non-carnivores. What they're talking about here is they are kind of referencing carnivores as basically anything who is obligated to eat over 70% of their diet as protein and meat, or coming from animal sources. Humans are not in that category. We are not obligated to eat more than 70%. We may have done historically, and I believe we did, and I still do. I eat about 95% from animal sources. But we don't come under this definition of carnivore if you read this study. And what it's saying here is that basically this GCK pathway is absent in those healthy carnivores, yet GCK deficiency can result in problems like diabetes in humans. So basically saying like we have different metabolic processes. So how can we really compare humans to carnivores as far as this study is concerned? And, Judy in her other video basically said you can use any study to prove anything you like. If you go into the studies and actually pick it out, you might see there's problems with the studies that we're talking about.
What they found in this article, which I find so fascinating, that carnivores that don't have insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia are showing similar makeups during periods that they're not eating carbohydrates.
Okay, but then we've also established that they basically don't eat carbohydrates normally anyway. So again, totally different scenario to human beings.
Showing that a normal response for dolphins when they are strictly eating carnivore is that their blood sugar goes up, and that it's a normal response, and it looks very mirrored to a metabolic illness, but that it isn't a metabolic illness.
Okay, so when they eat, blood sugar goes up. That is a relatively normal response. Yes. This article doesn't, as far as I can tell from reading it, and look, I may have missed it to be fair, but I don't think I did. I don't think it mentions anywhere about sustained high levels of blood glucose, which is what we are talking about. This article is talking about something entirely different.
Now, I will share all of these studies in the show notes, but it's so fascinating. So maybe our blood sugar is going up because it is a normal response, and that it is not something that means that we are becoming more sick or more diseased.
Yes, normal response acutely. We're talking about a chronic rise in blood glucose, not an acute rise after eating.
In this study, Dolphins and Diabetes Applying One Health for Breakthrough Discoveries is talking about how to observe dolphins and trying to support people with insulin resistance. But again, they have observed that dolphins are readily able to switch in and out of diabetes-like states,
which humans cannot. As far as I'm aware, humans cannot just turn diabetes on and off. Why are we talking about dolphins when they very clearly have very different metabolic processes.
For example, overnight fasted samples collected in the morning from dolphins showed changes mimicking populations of people with diabetes. When dolphins were fed,
Okay, but also sometimes humans will show that if like you get a dawn rise, for example, the dawn effect with cortisol, it might mimic diabetes as well.
big meal of fish, they had an insulin resistant response. And when they were fed with water with 10% dextrose, they had an insulin deficient response. So the ability of dolphins to switch from type 2 and type 1 diabetes provides a unique model for understanding diabetes and insulin resistance.
Well, yes, maybe, but we can't apply that to people on the carnivore diet having a high sustained blood sugar. They're totally different things here.
Well, there are not many people that eat a carnivore-like fashion that are humans. And so when we are
There's actually a lot of people following the carnivore diet now. A lot of people.
eating this way, maybe that is exactly the same thing that is happening to us. So it's
Probably not, because again, very metabolically different.
not that we are in a disease state, but this is a normal response when we are not eating carbohydrates.
Again, you can't take that from this study at all. It's looking at totally different things.
We are eating a different way than the average American or the average person, but our blood work measures and standards are based on the average population, then maybe it is not the right measure to be going after.
Yeah, look, that may well be very true, but this study and the other study that she's mentioned do not prove that in any shape or form.
Okay and understand that LDL can go up on a low carb, meat based diet. And we accept that it is okay that
Why are we talking about LDL now? We're talking about blood sugar.
LDL is above 150 or 180, and that our triglycerides should actually be under 100 when the standards is 150. So then why can't we accept or maybe consider, assuming that we are looking at all blood work and symptomatology, maybe blood glucose going up on a carnivore diet is okay.
Well, blood glucose has been studied probably far better than LDL and cholesterol is concerned. And, basically, LDL and so on is all been driven by drug companies, pharmaceutical companies, in the research and the pursuit of driving it down at all costs because then they get more money. Blood glucose is not that necessarily similar because if you keep driving down blood glucose, well, people die pretty damn quickly. So there is perhaps a finite ability for drug companies to push that agenda to keep pushing down blood sugar. So again, I think we're perhaps slightly conflating things here.
The last one isn't really related to this blood sugar, but I thought it was so fascinating while we're talking about dolphins. Anyway, they found that increased dietary intake of saturated fatty acids showed a decrease in ferritin. Now, ferritin is iron related. It's the stored version of iron, but we have seen in our practice, many people have high levels of ferritin. It is not because we need to just donate blood. Yes, that could be.
They very often do actually have very high ferritin. It still confuses me why some people get really high ferritin without hemochromatosis. It's probably a copper issue, but who knows?
Way to reduce it. And I don't recommend donating blood more than one time a year because you might just reduce your iron stores and you need iron to
You can probably get away with a lot more than one a year.
have oxygen in your body. But
Yes, you're not going to die because you donate blood. You're not going to run out of oxygen. Don't worry about that.
we see ferritin high when people have inflammation in the body that is not related to the diet.
Okay, but there's lots of other reasons you can also get a high ferritin, like iron sequestration from copper issues, which I mentioned repeatedly on the other video.
This study, they show that eating saturated fatty acids can reduce ferritin and other metabolic syndromes in dolphins. So again, if you were to combine all three of these studies, you see that dolphins, when they eat carnivore, their blood sugar goes up and it's a normal response. And then
Yes, that is a normal response to eating, Judy. I think we have established this. You can't use studies in dolphins to say that it's perfectly fine for blood sugar to be sustained, elevated for human beings. You're talking about an acute change in dolphins when they eat, and translating this into a sustained high blood sugar in humans following a strict carnivore diet is perfectly fine. No, those two things are entirely separate. You can't mix those two things. You may be right, but this does not prove it. This provides no evidence to support your claims at all.
When they eat saturated fats, their metabolic syndromes go down. I think it's so fascinating. I'll probably include some of this stuff in Carnivore Cure version 2 and even share more details and nuance about this. But when your blood sugar is going up on a carnivore diet or a meat-based diet, please understand context. I know we want to just focus on one number and say, now I'm healthy. But one number is just one number. You have to look at the big picture, always consider symptomology, always consider if you're feeling better, and then know that there's always nuances. And also consider working with a practice that works with carnivores so they know what the norm is versus just going to your standard doctor that doesn't understand a carnivore diet, doesn't support it, and will just give you reasons to stop eating that way when you know, in fact, that it's helping you.
Bearing in mind, a lot of doctors who are quote unquote carnivore friendly often have no idea what they're talking about either. Now, this is not a reflection on Judy or anyone out there in the carnivore influencer space. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about doctors on the ground. A lot of my patient base are people coming to me from other low carb doctors and carnivore quote unquote doctors who don't actually necessarily know what they're talking about. I'm not going to mention any names, of course, but they often come to me saying they went and saw other doctors and they just got bad advice. The general quote is they just don't get it. And so bearing in mind, a lot of people that are doing this kind of work day to day may not even know what they're talking about. They may just be watching videos like this and saying, oh, it's fine because, carnivore, so it's all good. I think the key thing here is you've got to ask them, why? Why does this happen? Explain it to me. And if they can't explain it, they clearly don't understand it. And that's when that should be raising alarm bells.
It gives you an idea of why carnivore can increase your blood sugar levels and why it may be okay in context. And just know that we see studies where it shows eating a carnivore diet can actually raise your blood glucose even in dolphins.
Okay, so again, why the heck are we talking about dolphins when we're talking about humans? That's pretty much the end of Judy's video, so I'm going to stop it there. But I want to show you a couple of studies. I mentioned these at the start of the video. I'm going to pull them up on the screen now. So Judy is talking here about red blood cells basically living longer on a carnivore diet. Therefore, your HbA1c will go up because they are exposed to more glucose throughout their lifespan. That may be true, but there is no evidence to support that. I am yet to find, and please look, if anybody knows a study out there that is disproving what I'm saying and proving what Judy and other carnivore influencers are saying about HbA1c, please send it to me. I want to read it, because if I'm wrong, I want to know. But the evidence that I've seen does not support that statement that HbA1c goes up on carnivore simply because red blood cells are living longer. I want to show you a couple of studies and then we'll talk a little bit about them. So this is a study. I'm going to highlight this here. The text is, although we found no statistical difference in HbA1c levels between the two groups that were measured, the blood glucose levels were significantly higher in the group with an RBC lifespan less than 90 days as compared to the group with an RBC lifespan of greater than 90 days. Now, what that basically means is between these two groups, red blood cells are living less than 90 days and longer than 90 days, there was no clinically significant difference in HbA1c. Therefore, if red blood cells live longer, they're not necessarily going to just automatically increase HbA1c. What they did notice, though, interestingly, was the blood glucose levels were significantly higher in the group with the red blood cells living less than 90 days, despite the fact they still had the same HbA1c, which is very, very interesting, but that doesn't prove or disprove anything particularly. But it's just interesting to note they didn't find any difference in the HbA1c levels between these two groups. And this is the abstract. I'll put it in the show notes so you guys have got it there. This other one I want to highlight here as well. Red blood cell lifespan less than 74 days can clinically reduce HbA1c levels in type 2 diabetes. Interesting. And you might think, well, hang on, that kind of proves what they're saying. If red blood cells live shorter and HbA1c goes down, surely the opposite is true as well. And that might be the case. But if we actually go down to look at these, HbA1c did not change in all of these groups. It was the same, or basically the same. There was ever so slight difference in Q2 and Q3 that lived very slightly longer, but then Q4 dropped down again. And there was really no clinically significant difference, as it says here. There were no significant differences between HbA1c values among the 4 groups. What they did say was when they corrected for the RBC lifespan, they think the HbA1c would have gone down. Therefore, that's the statement for the title. But the actual HbA1c values did not change. As red blood cells lived longer or less, there was no significant difference. Now, this doesn't, again, necessarily prove what I'm saying or entirely disprove what Judy is saying in this episode and other carnivore influencers. But I think what it does so is kind of cast a doubt on that statement that red blood cells live longer, therefore HbA1c goes up, and therefore that is not a problem on the carnivore diet. I just disagree with that statement. I don't think there is any evidence to support it, and I think there is evidence suggesting that it doesn't happen, as I've shown from these studies here. So I take issue with people like Judy, unfortunately, saying that this is perfectly fine when there is no evidence to actually support that at all. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.